freeze dry it. That's one way you could store it. A lot of people are looking at actually using bacteria to store the DNA. So bacteria have their own chromosome, that's a circular piece of DNA, but they also have these things called plasmids, which are small circular pieces of DNA that they can use to store genetic information too. So you could make DNA and insert it into the bacteria as these plasmids. And then there's some bacteria like Bacillus subtilis that when the conditions aren't conducive to growth will actually form spores, and these spores can endure extremely harsh conditions. So a lot of people are looking at using bacteria to store the DNA.
So in other words, we have really smart infections?
Well, something like that. You could think of it that way. But yeah, so those are some of the ideas. Yeah, it's a pretty fertile area of research.
How could they make that accessible to the public?
Well, I mean, this is part of the challenge right now, is that it's an idea that works in principle, and it's probably going to be best used for long-term data storage, not something that you're going to need to be able to, read and write to on an ongoing basis. But again, people are looking at ways to create systems that could be much more conducive to that rapid access of information. But that's one of the hang-ups. But there's a lot of data that we have that's archived that if you could just store it in DNA, for example, that would be really useful. Cooper.
Yeah. Do you think that DNA will be what's used for one of the next, in the next 10 to 15 years? Do you think there'll be a lot of advancement in electrical engineering with the sciences behind conduction and chemical reaction?
It's hard to predict, but where the DNA, like nanowires, become useful would really be in creating these nano devices. So people are trying to build machines at the molecular scale. And so, they're being able to get, power to those machines is going to be critical. And so that's probably where you'll see the DNA nanowires really be used, is in those kind of miniaturization. But as we're miniaturizing technology, I wouldn't be surprised if that's something in the forefront, right? Does that answer your question? Yeah. So Nick, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm sorry if I missed this in the last class, but just a question on the watchmaker idea. How often would you say is drawing time at that just to combat it? It seems like a silly notion, but I feel like there's definitely.
Yeah, I mean, time is oftentimes, time is used quite frequently as a response, that given enough time, these elegant designs are going to emerge. And we probably won't talk about it here, but one of the things that has been recognized is that the very first cells that appear on Earth appear roughly about 3.8 billion years ago. Now that's significant because it's not likely that you're going to have the conditions for life on Earth until about 3.8 billion years ago. So the very first cells are appearing almost instantaneously on the Earth. And there's growing recognition that these cells would have been biochemically complex. And so this is a real problem for evolutionary biologists that are saying, life evolved, but in terms of the time argument, you don't have it, right?
How does that work with scientists seeing trying to put the simple turning itself into complex? Do you feel like in nature we see simple becoming complex? I feel like what you're describing with the nanotechnology or the using DNA, right? It seems like we are trying to take a complex organism that's already existed and trying to make it more simple for us to apply it to our everyday lives.
Yeah, well, I mean, I don't think anybody has a full handle on the complexity of even the simplest cell. And any attempt that people are engaged in to try to create artificial cells in the lab. Any attempt on the part of people to do that, what they're producing are these really, really crude facsimiles of a cell. They're not even approximating the complexity of a cell. So, I mean, this issue of complexity is really, really challenging. It's something we don't have any hope of duplicating in the next couple of decades, I would say, easily. And the more that we're understanding what the very first cells must have been like, the more complex they are becoming. Because there's this concept in evolutionary biology called LUCA, which is the last universal common ancestor. This is believed to be that organism that is the ancestor to every life form that has existed in Earth's history. And it's right there at the root of the evolutionary tree. And the most recent work indicates that LUCA was incredibly complex. But if it was the organism that is rooting the evolutionary tree, it would have to have basically the full ensemble of biochemical machinery at that point. Because biochemistry is universal. In fact, we'll talk about this in a minute, is that biochemistry is universal to all life. Every organism has the identical set of biochemical systems, at least the core systems. And that means that LUCA would have had to have it. So you really have no time for complexity to evolve. It just happens at once. Does that respond to your question? Yeah. That time argument is used a lot, but it's I just don't see it. It's not an outlet. It's not an escape. Did somebody else have a hand? Oh, yes.
Okay, so hypothetically, if you take the synthesized DNA and you're injecting data in and everything, can you insert it into our minds after it has that data?
No, well, you can't do that. But I mean, it's Friday morning. We're going to talk about some of that kind of stuff, though. All right, so there is a technology called CRISPR gene editing, which is a very powerful technology that's very easy to use, where you can literally go in and modify the genetic makeup of organisms at will, including human beings. So people are looking at using that technology to modify humans. And right now it's mostly being pursued as a way to treat genetic disorders. But people are looking at this as a way to create designer humans or enhance humans by altering our genetic makeup. So you're not likely to infuse knowledge into somebody with that, but you could potentially enhance somebody's intellectual capacity beyond their natural limits. Of course, so that's the future that we're looking at, right? But, and we'll talk about this more, there are these things called brain-computer interfaces that people are building, where are electronic devices that you implant in the brain, and people can learn to control computer hardware and software as well as machinery with their thoughts. And it's pretty remarkable. It's one of the most competitive areas in bioengineering right now, and the advances that are happening are just breakneck. And it's really weird because you can learn to control, again, electronic devices with your thoughts, but they also are building these systems, these computer brain interfaces based on AI technology that can learn to interpret your electrical activity in the brain and then determine what your intention was and then carry out that operation. So you're not even having to think and to control something. It just is going to look at what is your intention and it'll extract that, which is really, really crazy stuff. But it's weird because the information can flow the other direction. So you can send electrical impulses into the human brain with these devices, and the brain will learn how to interpret those impulses. So people have done experiments where they're asking somebody the answer to a math problem, and they are, with these interfaces, sending electrical information into the brain that gives that person the answer. So they know the answer not because of math they did in their mind, but because of information that was, so it's really weird stuff.
Sounds like a great way to make a stupid person. You don't actually have to do any thinking, you're just as,
Yeah, well, I mean, we're getting a bit off topic, but since you're bringing this up, we'll keep talking. So, Elon Musk, everybody knows Elon Musk, right? Yeah, you do. You don't know Elon Musk? It's the guy that SpaceX, Tesla, right? Okay, this futurist he bought Twitter, right? Just bought Twitter. So he formed a company called Neuralink, where he's trying to build the next generation of these brain-computer interfaces. And part of what he sees is that this becomes the next user interface for electronic devices. So instead of voice command, you would just think and you would be able to control electronic devices. But his ultimate motivation is he's frightened that we will be developing AI technology that will get progressed to such an advanced state so quickly that it'll literally evolve on its own to become basically this system that would control human beings. And that the only way we can escape that inevitability is to interface our brains with computer systems so that we can augment our intelligence so that we can compete with AI systems. And in order to do that, you have to build an AI system that operates the brain-computer interface. So that's kind of the irony. But this is real stuff that's happening. You guys get to deal with this as you get older. Have fun with that. But what's your name?
Paige.
Paige, yeah.
I was just gonna say, aren't they using some of this to like work with people and like prosthetics and stuff,
Yes.
so that they can like sense and then also like be able to control the prosthetic?
Oh, I mean, the brain-computer interface technology is very exciting, and it's the people that are primarily working on this really see it for biomedical purposes. It's going to revolutionize, how we treat people that are locked in, that have brain injuries, that can't communicate. It's for people that are amputees. It'll give them the capacity to control robotic prosthetic limbs. People that are quadriplegic and paraplegic will gain the ability for movement because they can equip them with exoskeletons, and they can learn to control the exoskeletons. And in some of the experiments with the prosthetic limbs, people develop a sense of ownership where they begin to see that limb as actually part of themselves. So really, I mean, nobody should be opposed to that. It's just that if you can do that with the technology, there's other things you can do that we probably want to be very circumspect about. But
seems like the more things progress in technology, the more good it could do, the more evil it could do.
oh yeah, yep. Well, that's the fear, is right. The more powerful technology is neutral, right? You can use it for good, you can use it for bad. But the more powerful the technology is, the more devastation that can result from intentional misuse. But what's even more frightening to me isn't people getting hold of technology that are with malevolent purposes. It's unintended consequences where there's a side effect that nobody thought of, right? And so there's actually a whole area of ethics called neuroethics, where people, because of these brain-computer interfaces, they're raising so many ethical questions that people are now it's formed a whole new area of ethics where people are debating what is actual and ethical use.
Everybody's gonna have this, problem in 40 years.
Right.
Because they're
Well, I mean, it may be that, if you don't get a brain-computer interface implant, or you don't subject yourself to genetic engineering, you're not going to be able to function in the world that we live in. And so, that will create probably technological haves and have-nots. Some of it out of economic limitations that you can't get that technology. Others may opt out, but you're going to become probably, these are kind of the dystopian things that people are worried about. But the problem, like with the brain-computer interfaces, is it's ultimately a collaboration between the human and in the interface itself, particularly if you've got AI technology driving it. And so the question is, who's actually in charge? Who's actually making the decision? It's crazy stuff, right? But this is why it's really important to be just familiar with some science, whether you're ever interested in it, because these are the questions that are coming our way. And if we're not equipped to engage them intelligently, we basically are giving up any Christian influence, in this arena. Gosh, it was a couple of years ago now. I wrote a book called Humans 2.0 about all this. And I did some kind of thing, on a podcast on YouTube about, will the COVID-19 pandemic actually advance the transhumanist agenda? This whole idea is called transhumanism. And somebody from the US Transhumanist Political Party saw that podcast, contacted me and invited me to come on this, what they called this virtual enlightenment salon, where this was the US Transhumanist Party, all the big wigs in the party. They actually have a political party to advance the agenda. They invited me on as a Christian to talk about religion and transhumanism, and they were really impressed with the podcast I did. And so here I am on this went for 3.5 hours. I finally just said, I can't do this anymore. It's been 3.5 hours, and we shut it down. But literally, it was like 12 people and me, 12 transhumanists and me talking about these issues. But the point is that they were actually interested in a religious perspective. And when I was raising concerns that were motivated from my faith, they were actually very receptive. They actually wanted to hear that. And so if we can gain the respect of people like that, who are looking to advance those kind of agendas, and they see value, and there is value in the Christian worldview, because the Christian worldview does two things simultaneously. It creates an environment that is pro-science and pro-technology, because that's the way you live out the kingdom of God principles, is through this technology. But we also understand the value of human life and recognize the importance of protecting the marginalized, protecting those people that are vulnerable. And so it's a really powerful worldview that brings together these counterbalancing measures that really help us navigate how to use the technology and how to use it well. And so, so it's real important that we understand this stuff, right? You guys are living in a world that's going to be pretty crazy, and you guys have the responsibility to represent Christianity and represent it well. But anyway, so we're completely off track, but that's okay. This was a lot of fun. This is a great, hopefully this whets your appetite for what's going to come on Friday. Right. Okay, what I can do is let me go through this quickly, and what I'll do is I'll get to the main point here, and then we can discuss the ideas here further. And this is based on a talk that I put together a few years ago that to me was one of these aha moments that I've had. And again, maybe my aha moments aren't worth very much, so just keep that in mind. But to me, it was one of these aha moments where it gives us an understanding of why God may have created biology in the way that he created biology, right? And so, and it all stemmed from the fact that a few years ago I had a friend who died from complications from type 2 diabetes. Type 1 diabetes is a genetic disorder where the beta cells in your pancreas don't produce enough insulin. Type 2 diabetes is like an adult onset diabetes when you spend 60 years of your life eating Twinkies and Hostess Ho-Hos like me, you wind up causing yourself problems. And so I was actually, right after my friend died, was diagnosed with prediabetes, which is a condition where you don't have diabetes, but you don't have normal sugar levels. And fortunately, a certain percentage of people with prediabetes develop diabetes, but you can actually intervene at this point and control through your diet the onset of diabetes. But it's based on this really cool blood test called a hemoglobin A1C test. And by the way, you're never too young to actually take this test. So I would, you don't think about these things at your age, but when you go get a physical, ask to have one of these tests done, because it's a great way of telling you very quickly if you get type 1 diabetes. And I'm not going to go into the details of this. The science doesn't matter, so I'm just going to skip this stuff. But it turns out that try to develop ways to treat. Here's my whole lecture on diabetes and how insulin and glucagon work. So we'll just skip that. But we'll go to, what does a duckbill platypus have to do with diabetes, you might wonder, right? Right. So because of the concern with prediabetes, and you do not want diabetes, by the way. That is just a horrific, horrific disease. I can't think of a worse disease to have. I mean, it's just not good. There's a lot of attempts to try to develop drugs to treat type 2 diabetes, and it turns out that the duckbill platypus may actually hold the key to treating diabetes, believe it or not. And I actually got to see a duckbill platypus in person or live a few years ago when I was in Australia on the island of Tasmania. And these are cute little adorable creatures. We got to see them swimming around in a tank. But you do not want to handle a duckbill platypus. As cute as it is, you don't want to pick one up, all right? And this is the reason why. Because they have these little spikes. The males have these little spikes on the hind webs, that they can inject it into you, and or dig it into you, and it'll inject basically a venom. So these are venomous creatures. And the venom actually causes the insulin level in your blood to drop, right? And so this is the way that they ward off potential predators, is by injecting this venom into the predators, and immediately the venom causes the insulin level to drop, and that just creates lethargy in the predator.
Super smart.
Yeah, it's a really cool design, right? And it's something that I don't think will kill a human, but can cause you some problems. And it turns out that this particular venom has something called a glucagon-like protein in it, and so glucagon is like a hormone that counterbalances insulin. And so what happens is that when you eat a lot of food, the alpha cells in your pancreas secrete glucagon, which then causes the blood sugar levels in your body to drop, because it increases the insulin levels. Right, so I got it wrong. The venom actually causes insulin levels to rise and causes the blood sugar levels to drop, and that's what creates the lethargy. So like when you eat a big meal, you want actually insulin levels to rise because you're flooding your system with sugars, and so then the glucagon will stimulate the release of insulin, which causes the blood sugar levels to drop, right?
And you feel ready for a nap.
Right, then you feel ready for a nap. But that's actually good, because you don't want sugar circulating in your bloodstream, because sugar will react with all kinds of proteins, and that's what creates the symptoms of type 2 diabetes. So the idea is that if this actually can stimulate the production of insulin, if this drug can stimulate the secretion of insulin by the beta cells of the pancreas, it might be a way to treat type 2 diabetes, right? Where you give people this medicine, which would be with this glucagon-like protein, right? So the point here is that you got this duckbill platypus that is pointing the way to treating type 2 diabetes. All right, so we'll skip all that. So, as you said, Lexi, that's pretty cool, right? Well, I mean, you see the creator's ingenuity on display. But what's interesting to me is this, that a creature like the duckbill platypus, the biology, the physiology of this creature actually holds clues to how we might treat, again, a human disease. And this isn't the first time people have made these kinds of discoveries where creatures that we would have no connection to seemingly hold the key to treating diseases, right? Now, the way an evolutionary biologist would interpret this is to say, well, this is a reflection of homology, that because we have a shared evolutionary history with the duckbill platypus. Now, the duckbill platypus is a monotreme, which is a very primitive mammal. So it's believed to be this side branch, and then you have the eutherians, which are us, placental mammals, and then you have the, what do you call them? Good grief. The animals in Australia that don't have placentas. Good grief. Okay. I'm having a senior moment here. All right, I'll think of it. I'll think of it in the shower. But anyway, marsupials, right? Sorry. So you have placental mammals, marsupials. These are, from an evolutionary perspective, are considered to be two branches, the two different types of mammals. And then you have these monotremes, which the duckbill platypus belongs to, that are considered to be an ancient side branch. So evolutionary biologists would say, well, this is a primitive creature that would represent kind of the primitive state of being a mammal. And so the biochemistry of the duckbill platypus would actually have shared features with us as human beings because we descend from the same ancestor. That's how they would interpret or make sense of that particular result. And so the idea of homology refers to the notion of shared biological features, right? That many people say, well, the shared features that we see among organisms that naturally group together reflects an evolutionary history. So the quintessential example would be the forelimb of a vertebrate. Every vertebrate has a forelimb that has a long bone, the humerus, the radius and the ulna. There are wrist bones, bones in the hands, and then there are the 5 digits, the 5 fingers. And the point it would be that every mammal has a variation of that design, of that. It's called a pentadactyl architecture, if you're interested. So you got like the dolphin has that same design, you know, a mole, a horse has that same design. But it's been modified. The bones are modified even though it's the same core design. So evolutionary biologists would say that you've got this ancestral creature that had this particular design, and as it spawned different evolutionary lineages, those designs were modified. It's descent with modification. They were modified to produce new biological features that perform different functions, but were still, in essence, the same core design. And the fact is that this actually even is seen when you look at proteins as well. So you can actually look at the amino acid sequence of proteins and see the same kind of homology that you would see in macroscopic structures, right? So this idea of shared designs is deeply intertwined in the evolutionary paradigm. And so again, here's kind of showing this idea that you have this common ancestor with the vertebrate forelimb structure, and then as it produces these different evolutionary lines, that you see the same core design, but it's modified. And people would argue that you see the same thing with proteins, that you could use protein sequences and build these evolutionary trees. And so people see that this is, in fact, I've heard many biologists say this is the most compelling evidence that there is for evolution, is these shared biological features, right? But interestingly enough, this idea of homology predates Darwin. So it wasn't, even though this is considered to be the most compelling evidence for evolution, it's an idea that predates Darwin. In other words, biologists prior to Darwin knew that organisms that naturally group together would have these different, superficially different biological structures that had the same core design, the same fundamental design. And in fact, biologists prior to Darwin interpreted these shared features as actually evidence for design, not evidence for evolution, right? So people like Sir Richard Owen, who was a very prominent biologist prior to Darwin, interpreted these homologous features as reflecting an archetypical design that existed in the mind of a creator that was then functionally manifested in the created order. And so this is how Owen defined the archetype. It's the ideal or original or fundamental pattern on which a natural group of animals or system of organs has been constructed, and to modifications of which the various forms, such as animals or organs, may be referred. So,
Isn't it kind of like God's taking these essential elements and just making them however, like it's so many different ways. Like we have a piano with so many notes, and you can make so many different like melodies out of it or whatever. It's like he's doing the same thing.
exactly. So in other words, here's this idea, these shared designs that people say, again, is evidence for common descent. And again, prior to that, people saw those shared designs from a design framework, that exactly in the way that you're conceiving it, that these were archetypes that existed in the mind of a creator that were then implemented in the created order and varied as they were implemented in the created order, but they refer back to a mind. So what Darwin did is he took the idea of the archetype and he evolutionized it. So the archetype was replaced with a common ancestor, right? That's what Darwin did. But he owed actually a great debt to Owen, who developed this theoretical framework. In fact, he wrote a book about the vertebrate archetype that was presented to the Royal Society. And he basically argued that the archetype points to a deep and pregnant principle, some archetypical exemplar on which it has pleased the Creator to frame certain of his living creatures. This is actually in a scientific publication by a biologist. I can't imagine anybody using this language today. But Owen saw this as, again, reflecting the Creator's handiwork. Now, this is to build off of your point, Lexi. Owen saw this as being the ultimate expression of design. In other words, he marveled at the fact that the Creator could actually devise an archetype that was so diverse, that was so versatile, that it could actually be varied in so many different ways to create a wide range of different kind of biological organs, right? You get the point? It's one thing to come up with an archetype that then all the creatures are built around, but it's another thing to come up with an archetype that's so versatile that it can do all these things. And so he says, the satisfaction felt by the rightly constituted mind must ever be great in recognizing the fitness of parts for their appropriate function. But when this fitness is gained, as in the great toe of the foot of a man and the ostrich by a structure, which at the same time betokens harmonious concord with a common type, the prescient operation of the one cause of all organization becomes strikingly manifested to our limited intelligence. Do you guys get that? It's a bit dense. It's a bit dense, and it's not necessarily written in a type of English that we would be familiar with today. But again, that's the point that Owen is making. So the point here is this, is that when you hear people talk about homologies or shared designs, that this is unequivocal evidence of evolution, it's important to recognize that you could understand those shared designs as reflecting a common design that comes from the Creator. And that this is not just simply an ad hoc explanation that we're pulling out of thin air. There's actually a history in biology in which this idea was prominent among biologists prior to Darwin.
So I have a question. So like Darwin says that there's the first human that like everyone descended from that magically appeared from everything
Right.
together, whatever. But then we've been taught in other classes that they can trace DNA all the way back to Adam and Eve.
Right.
So how does that work?
Okay, the way that works is these creatures that precede humans, these hominids, I see them as creatures that God created that existed for a period of time and then just went extinct. I don't see them as evolutionary predecessors. The DNA tracing only goes back to the beginning of humanity. It doesn't go back further than that.
So this wasn't a person. This was just something.
Yeah, yeah. So the hypothetical ancestor is just this ancestral creature that is sitting at some place on.
Why wouldn't DNA go back to him? Because DNA would have been in everything.
Right. Well, this is where homologies come into play, because people would say, because we see homologous sequences in genomes of humans and chimps, for example, that those shared sequences reflect this evolutionary history. Whereas I would say that those shared
Evolution would have stopped after, like, if there was a big gap between their DNA and the next DNA, but then there's no gap for so long, how do you explain evolution?
Okay, because the idea would be that when you're looking at the genome of a chimp and a genome of a human, right, you're looking at organisms that are at the tips of the evolutionary tree. The assumption is there are all these creatures that existed prior to that go back to the common ancestor that we don't have the DNA sequences for. So we're inferring that there must be that they must have had a common ancestor because there are these shared sequences. But the way you could see that is those shared sequences reflect common design, not common descent. And again, this is an idea that goes back to
So do they think there's just not been enough time for human beings to actually do this evolutionary process?
no, they think there's enough time.
Since humans came around, since Adam and Eve, like it's been a few thousand years.
Yeah, well, I mean, if you sample the DNA of everybody in this room, you're going to see different DNA sequences for the same region of the genome. And it's because we have different ancestries, and as the different ancestral lines diverge, there are going to be mutations that accrue. So you're inferring that those ancestral relationships from the sequence differences. So it's all an inference. Does that make sense?
I have a question later. It's okay.
Okay. All right, we'll talk about it. Okay, so this idea of common design is something that is the way that we naturally interpret things, by the way. The way Richard Owen interpreted things, shared features, homologies, is the way that we naturally do this. So, for example, if we look at automobiles, right? As we look at automobiles, we note that there is an evolution in automobiles over time, right? But this evolution was something that was designed, and that there are these shared features that automobiles have. Automobiles today and automobiles at different times in automotive history, but that we naturally see those shared features not as evidence for an evolutionary history, but rather evidence for shared designs, whereas there's been biological innovation that takes place. Obviously, you have automobiles that retain ancestral designs, if you will, but there's new designs that then are utilized in automobiles from that point in time. But the point is that we naturally see shared features as evidence for common design, not common descent. Now, when I've made this argument, there are always skeptics with a response. And so one skeptic raised this question that I interacted with recently: why would a creator employ the same designs, right? So here's a guy named Phil that shows up on my Facebook page all the time with some kind of comment. And he posed this question. Just think about the diverse range of creatures an actual creator could have made. And yet we see creatures appearing like and acting like family cousins instead. What would compel an actual designer with unlimited power to design all creatures with the same template as if the design was a restriction on the designer? Perhaps it was to make belief more difficult, to make only rebellious hearts disbelieve, right? So that he put in a little dig there. In other words, if we're talking about this idea of common design, and we have a God who is an infinite creator, who, as we talked about yesterday, is an artist who loves to create, why would a creator use only certain designs in biological systems? The argument would be that makes more sense if it was common descent, not if it was common design. Well, if we think about it for a minute, if there was a creator that created in that way, if God created in that way, he definitely could. There would be an infinite array of biological systems, an infinite array of biological designs, and biology as a discipline would actually be impossible, because there is no way we could gain fundamental understanding of living systems. We could study human beings and we could learn about human biology, but that understanding would only be limited to human beings. We could study the bacteria E. coli and learn all we can about E. coli, but that's where our knowledge would begin and end. But what's amazing as a life scientist is that we can study the bacterium E. coli, we can take apart its biochemistry, and from that understanding, understand human biochemistry. That we can study a yeast cell, and from the understanding of the yeast biology, develop fundamental understanding about the biology of human cells. This is kind of crazy. We can study the venom of a duckbill platypus and actually discover how we might be able to treat type 2 diabetes. We can study a mouse, and from the understanding of mouse biology, develop biomedical treatments, right? So in other words, the fact that there are these shared designs means that biology can exist as a robust discipline. That is, we could think about biology being designed in such a way that the living realm is discoverable to us. This would not be possible if a creator used an infinite array of designs. Does that make sense? Does that make sense? And so I mentioned this earlier when Nick asked this question, that biochemistry is universal, that the core biochemical systems are found in every organism that's alive, which makes biochemistry possible as a robust scientific discipline. That there's only two different types of cells that exist in nature: the cells that comprise bacteria and the cells that comprise all multicellular organisms. So the same cell type is found in animals and plants and fungi, which again allows us to develop a robust understanding of cell biology. That embryological development among animals has a universal element to it. So we can study the developmental biology of a chicken, and from that gain insight into human embryology, right? Because of the universal nature of embryology. So why would a creator employ the same designs, right? Because God, number one, wants to be known, right? This is part of what we talked about yesterday. God is revealing himself to us through the record of nature. So by being able to understand biology, to be able to have biology as a robust scientific discipline, we begin to be able to recognize the creator's fingerprints, the ingenuity of what exists in biology, which points to a creator. So if a creator wants us to know him through the record of nature, the record of nature has to be intelligible to us. this is actually one of those ideas that also is equally mind-blowing, is why is it nature actually intelligible? Why can we actually understand nature? Well, if there is a God who reveals himself to us through nature, who made us in his image, then we should be able to see and make sense of the world around us, because this is the way that God is making himself known to us. That it also allows for God's providence to be unleashed. Do you know what I mean by God's providence? Do you guys, does anybody know what I mean by that? Yes.
Is that like God's plan for what he wants happening on the earth?
Yes, that's very much a central part of providence. But also part of providence is the idea that God has provisioned his creation so that it can sustain itself, but also that as human beings, that we can go to his creation and take from it what we need. That God is providing for us through his creation. So this is the way I'm meaning providence. But that's a very important part of providence is what you talked about, God's sovereign plan. So, good. So God's providence is unleashed. In other words, we can study the duck-billed platypus, and by learning about, again, its venom, it provides us with a way to treat, again, people with type 2 diabetes. Oh, sorry. That's my friend John Harrelson, who died from type 2 diabetes. So anyway, that's an interesting story about John Harrelson. I can tell you over lunch if you want. All right, so, gosh, it's almost 12. Are there any other questions or comments? Or did you guys get the main point of the, we kind of went through that fast. Did you guys get the main point of that? Yeah. So the idea here, again, is just simply this, is that the shared designs that we see among organisms is, again, argued as the best evidence for evolution. We can understand that as shared designs. That this has a rich history in biology, and that there's a good reason why God would that God would limit himself to producing organisms with shared features. And that's because it makes nature intelligible to us. All right? Okay, well, I guess it's all over with. So we're done. You guys, thanks a lot.
So I do have a couple questions.
Okay.
I don't know if I was communicating the question very well. I was trying to figure out if DNA makes us jump from these pre-human creatures to being human, and yet it's been 2,000 years of us being human, where it's like we're not evolving. So how does evolution continue in their mind?
Yeah, well, tomorrow we'll talk about that a little bit. But we actually are evolving. But the evolution that we're undergoing is actually, it's microevolution. Right, but a lot of people will say, well, because we have evidence that humans are undergoing evolution, it means that human evolution must be true. And so it's two very different forms of evolution. One